1. Well, everybody, I need to give a little disclaimer here at the beginning, or a little explanation here. Nicholas is not with me on this podcast. As you've probably seen on social media, and in fact, there may even be a coffee time. I'm, of course, recording this before we make any official announcement on the podcast, but I believe there will be a coffee time episode where we talk about Carol, our founder. Carol sadly passed away this Monday, and it's left a big hole here at Hoxie, one that we will never completely fill. Of course, you don't replace people like Carol. They are one of a kind, and we are incredibly blessed here at Hoxie to have had his leadership for as long as we have, and the prairie community is blessed to have had his expertise and his seed that was, helping build up the industry, along with a bunch of other great early pioneers in the prairie industry. Carol was right there with them at the pretty much the very beginning, and he has passed away though. And I just personally want to say I'm forever indebted to Carol giving me a chance at doing this, coming out of my former career, which was being a science teacher. And I'm just sometimes I can't believe why somebody would give me a chance, but Carol did. He was gracious enough and taught me as much as he could in the 3 years that I worked with him. So that is why Nicholas is not here. Carol, of course, is his stepfather, and so he's got some additional family things going on. But I am available, and this is a topic that I really, really am excited about. We have, so is it Dr. Mark Turner? Is it what's your official professional title?
It is, but you can just call me Mark.
What do your friends call you?
Generally just Mark.
They don't ever mess with you like Doc Turner or something like that.
Occasionally, but no, it kind of wears off after day one of getting the title. It just kind of all wears off. So
yeah. Well, I tell you what, you got the perfect mustache for like an old Western. I think you should go by Doc Turner. I think you're out there in Oklahoma. That's basically the West, and not you're the neighbor to Texas. So I'm sure there was some old West stuff that went on down there. But no, we're glad to have you on the podcast, and we're talking about something that we talk about in increasing levels of specificity, but oftentimes in general, right? We understand well that native forbs are and just native plants, I guess I should say, are critical to a healthy whitetail diet. But as to which ones and why, we need to call in someone like yourself. And so we're going to get into that. But I wanted to start here just to kick things off. In studying deer nutrition, what is something that almost everybody gets wrong about what deer need or want to eat?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. I think probably just starting right off the bat would just be the time of year that we need to be thinking about managing deer forage availability. Certainly a lot of hunters, they're only thinking about deer from, say, September through December or January. And yes. So just, incidentally, that's the only time of year that they think about deer nutrition, instead of thinking about it during other times of the year. And certainly, there's something to be said for having deer forage availability throughout the year. But a lot of hunters, I think historically, maybe this has shifted a little bit now, but they've really focused on fall food plots, acorns, standing grain, things of that nature, and certainly, especially if you're in a part of the country where winter forage is limiting and you have really cold, severe winters, there certainly is a lot of benefit to having forage during that winter stress period. But in terms of biologically, and especially if we're thinking about managing for larger deer or a healthier deer herd, we really need to think about managing for high quality forage availability during the growing season, because despite what you may see on YouTube or hear on other podcasts or whatever, deer forage availability is not just limitless during the growing season in a lot of places. Now, if you're surrounded by a sea of soybeans, then maybe a lot of the growing season is taken care of. But there's certainly, in most places, the vast majority of the country, there's a lot that's left on the table in terms of forage availability during the growing season that we ought to think about if we're interested in managing deer herds.
Yeah. So what's the effect of that then? Is it just a lower number of deer? Is it less healthy deer? Is it less, survival chance for fawns? I mean, what's the real risk?
Yeah, so all of the above, depending on the severity. Generally, if we think about the worst case scenario, certainly there are some places that are really low productivity in the coastal plain where deer, fawn survival can be decreased because of limited food availability. Not only do you have, in some cases, fawns starving, in other cases you have fawns that are more vocal because they're hungrier, they're more likely to get eaten by a coyote then. There was some really good work done by some colleagues, Marcus Lashley and Coulter Chitwood was involved in this project as well in North Carolina. And they found that basically does that drop their fawns closer to areas that were recently burned, which in that part of the world represented really high quality nutrition, those were more likely to survive, whereas those that were further from those recent burns were actually more likely to starve. So
really,
just as an example, yeah. But that's generally not that big of a deal in terms. I mean, that's extremely low productivity sites. In areas with more moderate or more normal productivity, we would tend to see, most places don't have as large of antlers. They don't have as heavy of does or as heavy of bucks as they might otherwise have. Certainly there's less fat reserves on those deer. And so, yeah, you certainly leave a lot on the table in terms of antler size of bucks and even, you think about parts of the world that have really productive deer herds where you're seeing more triplets, you're seeing fawns more productive, and in some cases fawns even breeding. Those tend to be more Midwestern states that in areas specifically dominated by agriculture, which again is just highlighting the fact that it's nothing magical about a soybean plant or an alfalfa plant to deer. It just represents high quality forage during the time that their antlers and body are growing. And so places that's limiting, you tend to see smaller deer and generally less productive herds, although that's not to say that you can't have too many deer in places with limited food availability. Oftentimes there's too many deer in those places as well.
Yeah. Yep. No, I think that's a great explanation there, and made me kind of think of another concept. So on this podcast, we don't just talk wildlife and hunting. We do a lot of that. We also talk agriculture and food for humans, like human diets. And this concept of food deserts is something that we're familiar with. They talk about different parts of our country that are food deserts for humans, where it's so much more difficult to find like food that's good for you, I guess, is a good way, simple way to sum it up.
Mm-hmm.
And what does, using that same concept to you, what does a food desert look like for a white-tailed deer?
Well, it can take a variety of forms. So you could think about a lot of, especially the eastern part of the country, closed canopy woods, relatively limited disturbance. There's hardly any sunlight hitting the ground. But it could also take the form of non-native pasture. Certainly areas that are dominated by non-native as well as native grasses, although generally the non-native ones would tend to be a little bit more dominating, but places that are dominated by grass, deer, grasses, comprise a very small proportion of a deer's annual diet, especially during the summertime whenever we're thinking about growing antlers and does that are producing milk for fawns. And so areas that basically have either sunlight's not reaching the ground or it's reaching the ground growing plants that aren't desirable forages for deer, that's kind of what I would think about. But I think something that's oftentimes overlooked that would kind of hit on this, if the only place that a deer has on your property is a food plot, that's going to represent somewhat of a food desert as well. Obviously, thinking about the landscape as a whole, if there may be food around you, but if your particular property is not providing attractive forage for deer, then certainly there's going to be some negatives from that. Certainly, some areas could serve as cover, but when food is limiting, that's going to be a major concern and a common problem that we run into on a lot of properties.
Yeah, that's well said. You brought up something in there, grass. I was kind of surprised you didn't go that route with your most common misconception, because I think most people think of deer just going out. And I mean, how many paintings of deer in a field grazing on grass, like some kind of indigenous cow species or something, where I think a lot of people just think that as long as you have plenty of nice, lush green grass, you're going to be feeding deer, but that isn't the case.
Right. Yeah. So deer they're not grazers. Things like cattle or bison we would refer to as grazers. They're also technically not browsers. They're closer to being a browser than a grazer, but technically deer are what we would call a concentrate selector, which sounds like a made up scientific term, but it really is pretty self-explanatory. So they're a selector. That means that they selectively forage, and they concentrate that selective foraging on the types of plants as well as the plant parts that are going to be higher quality. Whenever you think about a cow, for instance, part of the reason that cows can handle more eating less nutritious forage, and specifically grasses, tend to be higher in fiber and lower in a lot of the things like protein and minerals compared to a lot of the forbs and even some woody plants at times of the year. Part of the reason that they can handle that is because they're so large. And so, cows having a rumen similar to whitetails and other ungulates, they're so much bigger. And so because they're bigger, they can eat more forage and then take their time more in extracting those nutrients. The actual digestive process between a cow and a deer is different, but as you get animals with smaller body sizes, they actually have to have higher quality forage than an animal with a bigger body. So think about a cow can handle worse food than a elk, than a mule deer, than a whitetail. Even there's been some recent work showing that mule deer can actually handle a little bit lower quality forage than a whitetail. And so that just kind of shows that, along that gradient, really whitetails are in a spot where if they're relying on grass, I mean, they're generally just not going to eat grass, and you're not going to have many deer on your property if you just have grass. But that's really, really low on the list. And aside from cool season annual grasses like wheat, oats, and cereal rye, they're comprising far less than 10% of the diet throughout the majority of the year.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear that, and I think it probably does, clear up some misconceptions out there. But I like how I would have always said that a deer is a browser, and I think 99% of deer hunters would probably say that too. But a concentrated selector.
Yeah, and again, it's not, they're closer to a browser than a grazer, so it'd be more correct to say that they're more of a browser than a grazer. There's kind of a somewhat of a gradient there, if you will, but
sure.
But yeah, they definitely focus in on those high quality plants and those youngest, most digestible and highest in nutrient parts of those plants as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so here's another question then along those lines. We often talk about, on this podcast, I'm saying, we often talk about reality that, well, deer, I've said this many times, deer, they adapted to these native plants for millennia. I mean, that's all they had to eat. There were no soybeans for deer to be eating. There were no clover plots. There were no, name your favorite, bag of throw and grow food plot mix,
Right.
They were surviving on these plants as a concentrated selector. With the addition of these non-native forage crops that get thrown into the mix here, I mean, are deer going to, let's say if you had 100 acres of remnant quality diverse prairie, so we're talking over 100 species of plants, many species of forbs. And if you had then along with that, maybe 20 acres of white oaks, and then you have a 5-acre soybean plot. With the deer in with so much more abundance in the native food sources, are they going to pay attention still to that 5-acre soybean plot? Or because, they did so well without the soybeans for so long, would it basically just be the superfluous thing that they wouldn't find much value in, or because right now it's basically the exact opposite, right? We have these small prairies, we have these small oak timber stands, especially here in Iowa, surrounded by thousands of acres of soybeans. But if you kind of flipped that, what would be the effect on, coming from deer behavior, do you think?
So I'll give the classic biologist answer. It depends. So I think, all this is context dependent, right? So, yep. If you're on a property, there's no doubt that deer like soybeans, and there's no doubt that they probably are about as highly selected as any forage that you could provide.
Mm-hmm.
So it really depends more on the landscape context. I've been on properties where, typically, at least in a lot of the country, and even, again, depending on the landscape, y'all's part of the world, you wouldn't even recommend somebody planting less than a 5-acre plot, and usually less than 7 or 8 acres in soybeans, because the deer are going to eat it down to nothing in a night, basically.
Yeah.
But I have been on properties that had extensive coverage, and that relatively large properties, 1,000+ acres, relatively large coverage of native early successional communities, native grasslands, depending on the part of the country you're in, thinned and burned woods. In those cases, when there's extensive coverage of that, and you don't have 150 deer per square mile, and you're managing the herd to be in line with the nutritional carrying capacity, I have seen places where you could get away with growing a relatively small soybean plot because the deer weren't relying on that as their sole source of high quality forage on the property. So, So yeah, you certainly do see less use of, less intensive use of that soybean plot compared to a place where that's their only source of nutrition. The thing that I will say, that regardless of whether you're in a situation where you have only natives or you have, only soybeans or something like that, especially in a place where, soybeans or ag is really your main source of nutrition, think about the availability of that forage relative to the nutrition of deer. When do most soybeans go in the ground in your part of the world?
Some as early as around mid-April to some guys will finish up well into June.
Right.
Yeah, that kind of mid to late spring time frame.
Yeah. So if we think about that, and then we think about, let's just say June 1st, if you planted in the middle of May, the amount of biomass that they're providing is not that great.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly you could push your planting date earlier, and there are other forages like alfalfa that would be providing forage. But if you're in an area that's dominated by agriculture and all the deer have to eat and all their nutrition is coming from something like soybeans, of course you're going to have larger deer than a place that's just forested or there's not
Right.
much nutrition. I'm not discounting that at all, but during that time period when bucks are just starting to grow their antlers or does are in that late gestation or late in pregnancy, and even in some places they may be dropping their fawns and starting to need to find nutrition to support lactation. Your soybeans are about yay high.
Mm-hmm.
We're only
Yeah.
talking, they're just popping out of the ground. They're going to provide good nutrition later in the summer, which is also important. But even if you're in a place that's dominated by agriculture, there's a lot of good that can be said about having native plants there, because clearly deer are going to be relying on nutrition earlier in the year than when that biomass is really popping from soybeans. I mean, just because you can drive around in late July, early August and see big bucks standing out in the field eating soybeans doesn't mean that most of the nutrition to grow those antlers was actually from the soybeans. Certainly a lot of it was, but there was some during that early antler growth period that the soybeans either weren't even growing or they were only providing relatively limited amounts of forage.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting mental game to kind of walk through these scenarios, but yeah, it's just good points in general there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit here. We're kind of dancing all around it. You wrote an article here very recently for the National Deer Association, which has provided excellent information to deer enthusiasts, I guess we could say, mostly hunters, but I suppose not all are hunters, and certainly not only hunters make use of the information they put out there. But this article was on the three main things, or the three main nutritional components, I guess would be a good way to say it, that a deer needs in its diet. You list them as crude protein, phosphorus, and calcium. And when I was first starting to read that article, I'm like, now wait a minute, is he talking about bucks here? Because you think calcium, phosphorus, antler development, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you stayed consistent through the article in saying deer, and you even started talking. You've already mentioned it here in this conversation, the importance of lactation for the does as well. And it's just kind of it seems based on what I was reading there that those really are the three most important things that a deer needs to have a healthy diet. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot of other
Sure.
micronutrients and other macronutrients,
Trace
as well as
elements and things.
yes, and even things like energy that we might consider
Yeah.
that they need to meet those demands. But in terms of what's generally considered to be most limiting on the landscape, usually plants don't have a deer. There's not enough availability of forages that are high in crude protein and phosphorus. Calcium generally isn't as limiting as as was kind of previously thought. But all three of those are kind of the main nutrients that a lot of folks focus on whenever they're thinking about deer nutrition and the types of plants that deer like to eat.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that to be interesting. I guess I would have kind of along the lines of the grass misconception. You oftentimes hear people talk about, yep, you need the soybeans out there in your food plot during the summer for all the protein, and then when it comes around to winter, they need corn for all the carbohydrates for energy. And of course, I'd prefer those to be native plants instead of just conventional agricultural crops. One of which is largely intended to be turned into biodiesel and ethanol. But well, I guess really both are used for biodiesel. But the carbohydrate element of it, I was interested. It was interesting that wasn't listed in there, and protein was listed ahead of it. And I guess you're saying because of how limited it is on the landscape. I assume
And also just the time of year,
okay, sure.
yeah. So the
And they're probably just getting carbs basically in everything they're eating, right? Because they're eating specifically plant material.
well, and they're not really. That's not limiting during the summertime. Now, as you move later into the fall and then into the winter, carbohydrates, and just energy in general do tend to be a little bit more limiting,
Okay.
and that would be the sort of thing that I would start to consider then more so than crude protein in the middle of
Sure.
winter. But again, on a lot of places, forage is not as limiting in the fall and winter as it would be during the summer, and deer are not trying to support lactation or antler growth during that time either.
Right. Right. No, that's a good clarifier to put in there. So I've often wondered then, Mark, with still needing the carbohydrates in the winter months. You think of native plants; they've been the rock star for the diet up until winter. Um, Certainly, there are some species that hold on to their seeds, and maybe deer get some value. I think that's probably better for like quail and turkeys and pheasants and songbirds and things like that. I would think probably make more use of the seeds because they are so small on native plants. But maybe like Illinois bundle flower, or some people call it prairie mimosa. It can hold on to its seed for quite some time, I believe. Bush clover is kind of the same thing. But aside from seed value, do do these do native plants have much forageability in the winter? I mean, it's all the grasses. Of course, they aren't eating much grass anyways, but everything's just the leaves on the forbs are all dried up, and the grasses have senesced and have all become crispy and brown. I mean, are they still pulling carbohydrates and calories out of things like that, or are they specializing on tree branches and corn, corn kernels of corn on the ground, things like that?
Yeah, so again, it all comes back to availability. Certainly, deer are really going to hone in on those energy rich food sources during the winter time if they're available. So if they're standing grain, they're certainly going to make use of that. They'll also make good use of things like you know cool season food plots, or cool season agronomic plantings of things like wheat. Those also have sufficient energy. They're not necessarily high in energy, but it's sufficient to meet their maintenance level demands.
Sure.
But in terms of native plants that deer are going to get a lot of use of in the wintertime, there are certainly several forbs that will have winter rosettes or basal rosettes
Mm,
that they can have access to throughout the
I never
winter.
thought of that. That's a good point.
Those do get some use, certainly more use if they're available versus not. But then the other two things that I really like to think about, especially for wintertime, would be acorns of red oaks. Now, you can't count on having acorns every year because, deer are going to drop, or oaks are not going to have acorns every single year. So there's variation between species. There's variation in the timing that they're available. But those red oaks tend to have acorns that are higher in tannins, and those are going to be more readily available later into the fall and into the winter. So those are going to be commonly used. You're also going to see again a lot of use of woody species. If there's not other food sources, and even in cases where there are, the backbone of kind of winter nutrition for deer on most places is going to be woody browse, and so there's something to be said about not eliminating woody species, in more either early successional or grassland systems.
Yeah.
Certainly, you want to maintain that forb coverage and have some grass to help you burn. But if you end up losing the coverage of those woody plants, that's going to be a negative. And so I'm really thinking about managing the woods such that I do have some woody browse in the wintertime, as well as from some of the more desirable woody browse species out in fields. Not just trying to broadcast eliminate those, but allow some of those to persist.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've always wondered about that. What is the benefit of that? But that's a good point, especially on the rosettes. I should have thought of that, but that is a good point. Okay, yeah. So we've kind of laid out what they really need. What are some of the advantages of? I mean, because it is easier to just grow soybeans, Mark. It is easier just to plant a big old field of soybeans and maybe leave back a certain percentage of them to be there throughout the year. Obviously, you mentioned like the timing is critical. So first and foremost, you talked about this. By the time those soybeans have started to become available to eat after they're planted, there's a significant gap in time there. And there's some native plants, some early sprouting native plants that can fill that gap there. But anything else? Is it just, we hear all the time, like especially in ecology, diversity is the key to a healthy ecosystem, and is that just, is that as big of a deal for deer nutrition as we often preach that it is? Do deer truly like having a whole bunch of different native forbs to select from, or is that kind of overblown?
No, I think there's a lot to be said about that, and I think that there's a couple different things that come into why diversity might matter within a plant community. Again, we got to think about just having, like, the first thing when I'm looking at a property would be just having enough biomass of high quality forage available either on the property or on the landscape, whether that's agriculture or whether that's native plant communities. So certainly that's kind of like step one, is just making sure that there's enough availability of forbs to feed the deer that we have on the place. The second step, though, that I would start considering is the diversity of forage. That could be from planted forages, having different species that we've planted in food plots and things like that. But really more specifically to this conversation, I do think a lot about the diversity of native plants that are available for deer to eat, for two reasons. First, the timing, just at its most basic level, the timing of availability is going to be different between species. There are some species, such as daisy fleabane, that comes on really early in the spring. It's very highly selected by deer, very nutritious, but it's seeded out, and the leaves are senescing, and it's pretty much done by the time we get to the middle of summer, compared to something like pokeweed that would tend to produce forage that's high quality later into the summer. And there's obviously many other examples where if you have more plant species diversity, and specifically here species that deer eat, that's going to be beneficial just because there's going to be differences in timing of peak nutrition. The other thing, though, to consider is there are differences in forage availability, and oftentimes when we think of deer nutrition, we're really focused in on providing enough nutrients, and for most landowners, that's kind of step one that they're probably not accomplishing right now, is just providing enough plants that are high in nutritional quality. The problem with that is, similar to cattle, there are forages that are too high in some nutrients that deer will then tend to avoid. Sulfur is kind of a classic example. That there's good work from in the cattle world that shows that cows can have problems if they consume too much sulfur. There's similar work with deer showing that deer do tend to select against some species, at least at some level, that are higher in sulfur. And a lot of the forbs that we're promoting, several of them that are really good forages and really high quality, coincidentally also tend to be high in sulfur. And so by having some plants that are higher in nutrients that deer want, and others that are maybe high in nutrients that deer want, but also don't have some of that toxicity concern from things like sulfur, is going to be beneficial. And so I think in general, just having a diversity of plants allows deer to kind of pick and choose the plants that they want to meet their needs, while also avoiding any toxicity issues.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, the toxicity side of it is one that I keep learning just slightly more about. Our other coworker we have here, Riley, he raises bison and uses bison to help restore prairie, and so he's very interested in native pasture and how some plants can have that effect, and but we've also heard too that sometimes that can be overblown. Like Jeremy French, we had on from the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, talked about how a lot of people fear having their cows graze on milkweed, common milkweed, And he said, he presented some research to us that there was a study that said that that's not really as big of a deal as people think it is, and so. But I do think that it is an important part of it, like a new secret we're unlocking about how animals utilize native plants. So it's a great point.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
and I'm certainly, just to clarify, not concerned about deer keeling over dead from eating some
Sure.
plant or something like that. It's just that, by allowing them to selectively forage on the things that they want to. I mean, it's similar to in cattle, you tend to see more problems with toxicity when you elevate stocking rates to the point at which they don't have the ability to be selected. And it's the same with deer. If we limit their forage availability, either by not providing enough of it or because we have overabundant deer populations, they then don't have the ability to be as selective because there's just not as much food out there per mouth. So, I'm not worried about toxicity from a standpoint of deer dying or anything like that. But we do want to consider the fact that having diversity allows deer to avoid that just naturally by picking and choosing what they eat.
Yeah, you're essentially just putting more options on the shelf for them.
Exactly.
That's a great point. Okay, yeah. So along those lines, we have a whitetail deer mix, which I should send to you. Have you just look it over and see what you think. Give us a grade on it. But at first, when we first did it, we had some general understanding, and then this last year we retooled the whole thing and put quite a few hours of research into what species are useful to deer, what do they like to eat, and what don't they like to eat. And while we were doing that, we realized we had some species on there that deer actually really do not find to be very palatable. And what was interesting was it had kind of a common thread just that I noticed from working with these species and growing some of these species. Very strong smell to, very fragrant. So like the mint species, I want to say another one on there that they didn't like was wild bergamot, which I think is technically in the mint family. Mm-hmm. It's not, like Virginia mountain mint, which we grow, that smells like Crest toothpaste. I'd say wild bergamot smells much more like, your grandma's potpourri on the back of the toilet or something like that. But anything that rattlesnake master, I think, was also on there. Very, very strong smell to that. Maybe sweet coneflower might have been on there. Have you found that yes, I guess first of all, it's true that there are some species that deer just don't like. And then if so, is it just a matter of, okay, they don't eat it, but it doesn't impact their behavior beyond that? Or do you actually see there's a repulsive effect to, oh man, there's mint over there. I'm going to skirt around that area because it smells so strong and I hate that smell. And I mean, it kind of makes sense we know as deer hunters, we understand well how strong of a sense of smell deer have. I mean, they can pick you off. If you don't have the wind blowing just right, you can go ahead and kiss your opportunities away that day. But, it's, what have you observed with that?
Yeah. So, in that case, I don't think that deer are going to avoid an area based on, the smell of a plant or anything like that. What you're most commonly seeing in those cases are just deer avoiding secondary compounds. And so secondary compounds are things that, among other things that they can do, they can produce scent, and some of those more fragrant species do tend to be higher in those secondary compounds, which would then act as basically nutrient binders to prevent those forages from being as easily digested. Again, that's not the case in every single species that smells, but a lot of the time when you have plants that, if you look at the nutrient levels, you think, well, deer should eat this, but they really don't. Mm-hmm. And same for any herbivore. A lot of the time, it's just those secondary compounds and them not being able to process things like tannins. as easily as forages that are lower in those compounds.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, the tannins with I never thought of it that way. That's truly that's purely a taste, right? The tannins they just and aren't I mean there's other animals that avoid or that prefer white oak acorns over red oak acorns because of the tannins as well, right?
Right, right. Yeah, that's pretty common across most species that they'll select the white oak versus the red oak if both are available. And yeah, so that's just another example of secondary compounds, but several of those are also present in leaf tissue, and deer will selectively forage on things if they are to avoid those if they're in a situation where they're starting to be filled up with things that have more of that.
Sure. Okay, so another thing I noticed in your article, and I've seen this before in other articles on the National Deer Association website, the mention of these native what most people would consider weed species, but they are native species. Mare's tail. That one surprised me the most.
Yep.
The ragweed and let's see, pokeweed was on there, and lamb's quarter. Those are all species that love disturbance. I mean, a year one prairie planting is going to have all kinds of those things that we just mentioned, other than maybe pokeweed. You don't see a ton of pokeweed, but it's there. It's you see it on occasion. It's more of like a true like timbered edge, disturbed timber edge, I guess, coming into prairie or ag field or something like that. But lamb's quarter loves disturbance. There's got to be some kind of correlation there. I mean, just do you think if we rewound the clock 1,000 years, first of all, other than Native Americans setting fires and maybe buffalo and elk wallowing, I guess maybe flash floods or something. I mean, where are we naturally going to be getting all this disturbance that is going to, produce the perfect conditions for all of these species to exist? I guess there's got to be some kind of correlation there.
Well, I mean, if you think about historically, and again, it varies widely between the part of the world that you're talking about, but we really do live in a place that disturbance is in some ways become less common, especially from fire, but and grazing to some extent, depending on the system. But think about things like tornadoes and hurricanes and floods. All those things are going to be reducing canopy coverage in forests, and then you pair that with across much of the eastern U.S. Fire from Native Americans, as well as lightning fire, especially in the coastal plain, but even in some other areas, fire used to be much more common than it is now, and so yeah, I think there's a lot less disturbance that you've kind of lost. You've lost fire out of a lot of those systems. You've also lost, especially in more grassland systems, having a large herbivore that would follow the fire, that would then, tend to promote more forb coverage after, in that time immediately after fire. So you've really lost a lot of the natural disturbances within the system that would have maintained coverage of some of these species. And again, I listed just a few in the article. There's obviously several other species that the deer selectively forage on that provide excellent nutrition. But a lot of the species that are going to be most nutritious and most highly selected by deer are some of those more annual, or a few of those are more biennial species. It's not necessarily always going to be something that's perennial or anything like that. And you think about the life cycle of those species, they've got to germinate, get through a growing season, and die and produce seed in order to persist on the landscape. Well, during that whole time, that means that they're actively growing. Whereas, there's several other species that are more, more even within forbs, more prairie dominant or more grassland species that tend to have a longer life cycle than that. And that's not to say that I don't want those species on my property if I'm managing for deer, but it's just to say that you do need a lot of disturbance that's going to promote more of those annual and
Sure.
biennial forbs, because those are the ones, just because they're forced to complete their life cycle within a single growing season, or two growing seasons, they are going to tend to be higher in quality. And so when you think about what the landscape used to look like, and it's hard to say, and only God knows and people that were there what it looked like at the time. But
Right.
from just reconstructing based on historical accounts and fire history and things like that, I mean it's probably likely that certainly you had large herds of large herbivores moving around, and maybe deer weren't moving around at the same scale that things like bison were.
Yeah.
But certainly, I mean, we see even now deer selectively using areas. If you burn an area in
Yeah.
April or May, just a few months after that forage availability and quality will peak, and you'll see deer heavily using that. So,
Yeah.
I tend to think of deer, operating, in a similar way at a smaller scale, to where they would be just moving around, actively foraging on that those areas that were freshly burned and in some cases grazed. And again, depending on the larger scale disturbance, there obviously were other things going on that they would also selectively take advantage of.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think fire and grazing are the two that we've really lost out of the, at least fire and grazing in the way that it would have occurred historically. Those are what we've lost.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are interesting points, and I think that something that probably ties into it too is we know deer as edge species, and you're going to typically find the greatest amount of disturbance along an edge. It's just going to be, like you're saying, the travel pathways for some of these larger animals and things like that, and maybe there's a correlation there too, because really in a mature prairie, you don't find a lot of mare's tail, you don't find a lot of ragweed, just around the edges you will, where dirt's getting stirred around a little bit more. But very, very interesting concept. Another one I have along that is invasive plants. So Iowa grows anything, right? Our soil wants to grow whatever it can get seed for, and so we get all kinds of invasive plants. Through your research, have you come across, I mean, obviously somebody might be listening to this and say, well, Dutch white clover, red clover, those are invasive plants. And yeah, they might be onto something there. But I'm talking like true, like nobody plants them. They just end up here. Things like bush honeysuckle or Sericea lespedeza or bird's foot trefoil. Hairy vetch or crown vetch, is there any research into deer adapting to all these invasives and utilizing invasive forbs for a significant portion of their diet?
Right. So depends on the species, and really in terms of forbs that are especially the more noxious, more invasive ones, like Sericea. Deer don't really eat Sericea very much. It's another one where the secondary compounds are a problem. It's actually fairly high in protein, and phosphorus as well, but the secondary compounds,
That's interesting.
deer. I mean, if you see deer hardly using Sericea at all, it's definitely should be a sign that there's not enough forage on your property. But thinking through, there's not that many. There are several that are non-native, but in terms of ones that I really think of as being super aggressive, part of the reason that that they may be as successful as they are is because they're not receiving that herbivory in a lot of cases. So you do tend to see things like bush honeysuckle or privet or autumn olive. Those certainly will receive use by deer. Japanese honeysuckle is another one that they will use those plants. especially after disturbance, either burning or cutting, where they're fresh resprouting. They are, just by the numbers, relatively nutritious, but it's one of those things that if deer on your property are relying on that, that should be a major red flag for you. Certainly, I'm not going to get bent out of shape out of having a couple plants here or there that the deer are using. But if deer are having to rely on non-native plants on your property, and especially invasive plants, the vast majority of those are not going to be nearly as nutritious, and also not as highly selected. Another one from in the south that does get used would be kudzu.
Okay, yeah,
Kudzu does get foraged on by
that's
deer.
interesting.
It's not it's certainly got moderate forage quality, but again, it's not a plant that I want on my property for
Yeah,
other
no
reasons.
kidding.
There's certainly a lot of other species that I could be promoting that would be just as nutritious, if not more nutritious, and also not have some of the other problems associated with it. But yeah, for the in terms of forbs, especially, I mean, like Sericea, which to me is the worst non-native species, as well as and especially forb. That's one that I'm not gonna try to promote for deer food or for
Yeah.
any reason, but it's hardly ever eaten by deer.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially when you do consider the nutritional benefits of something like that. But those secondary compounds that you mentioned, that's really interesting.
Well, and it's the same. That plant's an interesting one because it's kind of the same for quail. It actually opposite of deer, quail do commonly eat it, and on places
Okay.
that there are good numbers of quail and a good amount of Sericea on the landscape. In some cases, it'll be just about as common as anything that shows up in the crop of a quail.
Hmm.
The problem is the seeds are hard, and so those seeds having such a hard coating on them, they're not very easily digestible. And in fact, quail gain no nutritional benefit from eating
Hmm.
Sericea. And so, I mean, there's been trials in the lab that if you feed a quail just Sericea seeds, it will die with a
Hmm.
full crop. And so
That's
it kind of
crazy.
makes it even worse in some cases than the deer situation. And to make matters worse, they actually, through their, they can't digest it well enough to get nutrients, but they do scarify the seed. Um,
Ugh. So
yeah,
they're propagating it.
exactly. Which
Ugh.
that's from an ecological standpoint, it's a successful plant for a reason, but
Hmm.
it's definitely one that if I'm managing my property for wildlife, I don't want to have, and I want to decrease the coverage as much as possible.
Yeah, that is really really important for people to understand. You think that the memo had gotten out on invasive species, a while ago, but I just recently I saw somebody post on social media about how beautiful Iowa is because of all the corn and soybeans and all the bird's foot trefoil and all the hairy vetch. And I kept my mouth shut because I respect this person. I didn't want to, be that guy, but I wanted to say I had it all typed up and everything. One time I saw somebody make a comment. I want to go to the place where all the unsent text messages and Facebook comments go, you know, just to see what's been said, or what was almost said. So I sent it to the land of unsent Facebook comments, but I wanted to say, imagine how beautiful it'd be with all of our native plants. But
Hmm.
it's true that people they still propagate stuff that shouldn't be propagated, or they don't. Usually today it's just they don't get rid of it. They don't control it. They just let it take over. But yeah, it's a sober reminder that we have to keep sight of that, not just be so concerned about having what we do want, but getting rid of what we don't want, too. It's an important ecological service that, we need to offer. Okay. So as we wind this one down, if you could design, your dream hunting property, I'm debating if I'm going to make you say what state it has to be in because you got that OSU shirt on there. Well, how about we'll do a region? We won't make you say a state, but we'll make you say a region. You got to pick a region, You get to pick your ratio of. We'll say it's a 500 acre. No, let's do a more round number. 1,000 acre farm. You get to pick your region and your ratio of forested acres to non-forested acres, and how are you going to set it up for optimal herd health and also a good hunting opportunity.
Man, just left it wide open, didn't you?
Yep, yeah.
Yeah. So for me, just based on the proximity and also in terms of the sorts of landscapes that I've really come to enjoy working in, I'm probably thinking Southern Great Plains. You know, if you want me to be more specific, probably Kansas, just in terms of having a little bit more restrictive season structure and things like that. But there's lots of places in Oklahoma that look just as pretty, if not prettier. So somewhere Southern Great Plains, or either Great Plains or cross timbers, where you have a mix. I mean, I could go anywhere from 20% all the way up to, let's just say 60 or 70% wooded versus forested. Or wooded versus open. I don't have a real strong opinion on that. I probably want to be, I would say probably somewhere between 20 and 50% forested. I wouldn't be terribly upset if I did have some agriculture either on the property or around it. I probably would want most of my open acres to be native plant community, just because I enjoy managing that, and there's a lot of other benefits for turkeys and quail and pheasants.
Bingo.
As well. If there's
I'm glad you said
property.
that. We'll come back to that. I love that.
So I'm going to be managing, with fire frequently. Probably going to be, doing some forest stand improvement in the woods, getting a little bit of sunlight on the ground. Also doing cedar removal in, at least the majority of the woods, and certainly the grassland acres as well, to where I'm not relying on that for my cover. I can instead either use native woody species or use things like, or not that cedar's non-native, but less aggressive woody species, more shrub species for cover, as well as things like even hinge cutting in the woods, to concentrate cover. And then I'm going to be frequently burning, both in the woods, but especially in the openings, on a pretty frequent fire return interval, probably every, depending on how far to the west I am, probably on average every 2 to 3 years, to maintain good forb coverage. And that probably pretty well sums it up. And like I said, the exact place doesn't really matter, but I definitely want probably more open ground than not, and that can really allow you to concentrate the cover, to have more, a little bit better ability to pattern deer, as opposed to having broad swaths of cover.
Sure.
So
yeah, I think that's great. I like how you chose that region too. I think it's the more I'm around it, I think people they like where they hunt. You know what I mean?
But if I had to be in southern Iowa, I also wouldn't complain.
You wouldn't have to twist your arm too hard. Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the secondary benefits of that. We recently had Kyle Leibarger from the Native Habitat Project on the podcast, and he went as far as saying, I think we need to quit managing for deer. He's like, look, deer live everywhere. They're all over people's HOAs eating their hostas, and we don't really have a problem bolstering deer herds. And obviously he's speaking in generality there. There are certainly cases where people want there to be deer. Deer have been there historically. They're native there, and they just aren't doing well. There's not many of them there, and that's a different circumstance, of course. But in a lot of the world where people are managing for deer, deer really are not struggling to do well. But a lot of those other species that you mentioned are. And, when you manage for quail, or you manage for turkeys, or you manage for songbirds, or you manage for pollinating insects, a really neat thing about deer management is you get deer as a return for investing in improving the habitat quality for those things, because general concepts like we talked about in this biodiversity, high number of forbs, having the right even location like you talked about, the right geography and topography for it, all those things. When you maximize those things, then deer just in general do better as well and are healthier as well. And so I think that, as someone who's an avid deer hunter themselves, talking about myself here, I think that's a good way to almost reframe the conversation around managing property for deer. I think the idea of having a much more holistic way of doing it. We have a good friend, Thomas Milsna, up in Wisconsin, who does holistic land management practice. And that's exactly what he's aiming for. He's wanting to address the whole ecosystem and elevate the whole ecosystem by incorporating like that. But it's also interesting to hear you say, having agricultural fields, the way you said it wouldn't hurt your feelings, but that to me says that you acknowledge that there is some kind of inherent benefit that those fields do provide for someone who's really interested in there being a lot of deer around.
Yeah, certainly. And like I said, I mean, there's a gradient, and I'm sure that y'all even see in your part of the world, there can be too much ag for even deer. Places,
right. Yeah.
places where, it's flat as a pancake and that's the only thing for several square miles are not where I'd want to be if I was managing for deer. And I certainly agree. And I think, especially for landowners that are managing with deer and turkeys as their kind of two primary objectives, certainly turkeys do require, they have a little bit more nuanced life history requirements that do allow you to kind of inherently promote diversity. But I think the one thing I would say is just that the species that most people, if they buy recreational property, their number one species is going to be whitetail deer. Yeah. And regardless of whether we would rather they manage for something else or not, I mean, it's probably always going to be whitetail deer. And I don't think there's too much we can do to change that. But, something that I've kind of adopted by my mentor, Craig Harper at the University of Tennessee, is if we're going to have people managing for deer, why don't we take advantage of that? And instead of just throwing our hands up and saying, well, we have deer everywhere. Well, we do have deer in most places, but we don't have as robust a populations. We don't have as large of antler sizes. And so if we can leverage their interest in managing for deer into a way that they can then focus on managing and promoting native plant communities, I think that's great. And that's why I probably don't have as purist of an approach in terms of, I plant food plots. I enjoy planting food plots. That's something that, I'm not going to look down on, but I also, know from a holistic management standpoint that can't be the focus of all of our management. We really need to focus on the native plants and allow other things that we do to kind of supplement that. And, if we can have more people managing, let's just say 80% of their properties in a holistic manner, to me, that's a bigger impact than, having a few less that are 100% all in on just holistic. So, I kind of look at it from a more realistic perspective, a realist's perspective, rather than trying to be, a purist. But I totally agree. I think there's a lot that needs to be done, and a lot of folks within the deer management world that need to, kind of get refocused and understand that what they're doing is not, as beneficial for either the deer or the ecosystem as it could be.
Yeah. I think that's where that last part there, I think is, you hit it just right on the head. That's where the biggest risk of it is where you can start making those shortcuts where you don't incorporate native plants and you focus on some of these other shortcuts, like doing, all these non-native screens, like miscanthus or whatever, or
Yeah.
pampas grass, things that have no ecological value, and you can really short sight it, or focusing so hard on it. Got to have a kill plot. Got to have a kill plot. It's this little tiny postage stamp of something that has zero benefit to anything other than maybe a deer coming in there at the right time, grabbing a few mouthfuls before he, takes an old rage to the cage, right? But
Exactly.
well, this has been awesome. One other thing I kind of thought of while we were discussing this, that kind of dawned on me as you were describing, like laying out like good, nutritional setup for deer. Makes me wonder if that's why urban deer populations, obviously the lack of hunting pressure there is number one, but they really do have a pretty diverse diet in an urban environment. People having little flower beds and people having, even gardens, vegetable gardens and things like that. There's that diversity in diet, and the ability to kind of take this back to your article, that just a better chance at meeting those three critically important nutrient needs that they have. And so I think we can kind of almost look to that example, as because I'm going to tell you now, I've seen a lot of really nice bucks across the state of Iowa, but I think, with the exception, I think the biggest buck I ever saw was not a urban buck, but the other several that I've seen were all urban bucks. And I have a good friend, Chris, who shot I think he was a 208 this last year. Was on an urban tag here in Iowa, and there's a lot of diversity in people's landscaping and everything else in an urban environment compared to some of these rural environments that might just be dominated by old pasture, corn and soybeans and some Japanese bush honeysuckle back in the timber. Promoting these diverse plants really helps meet the needs of these animals that, like you said, are just the most charismatic animal here in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. How can people follow along with more of your work? Is most of it showing up on National Deer Association, or do you publish elsewhere too?
Yeah, so a lot of, just in terms of especially popular press type stuff that would be more towards landowners would be on the National Deer Association website. They can also just Google Mark Turner Wildlife Extension, OK State, or OSU, not Ohio State, Oklahoma State.
Yeah.
And they can follow along. I've got a web page on the OSU website. They can also follow me on Instagram, Extension Wildlife Doc. I'll post about various things, research projects and things like that. And then we've also got a podcast that I do with a couple of colleagues here that's Blazing, Grazing, and Other Wild Things. So
awesome.
I
love it.
On various podcast apps, and we talk a lot about fire and grazing and various wildlife concerns in Oklahoma and beyond. So yeah, just look me up on the OSU website, and happy to be here, and much appreciate the opportunity to come on.
That's awesome. Hey, make sure you gobble up that Doc Turner handle on Instagram before it's gone too. I think that'd be a pretty sweet handle. But we really appreciate you, Mark, and thank you so much for all your research that you've done and made available to people through these different mediums that you mentioned here. And we I feel like I learned a ton today that can be easily applied back to what we do here, where we grow native grasses and flowers for people to do their own prairie reconstruction. So if you're listening, you would like to pick up a seed mix, we do put together a whitetail mix. I think we also have quail mixes and pheasant mixes and turkey mixes as well that we custom design to help reach your goals, but also promote biodiversity on the landscape and healthier ecosystems. So thank you so much to everyone tuning in. Head over to hoxieNativeSeeds.com to check out everything else that we got. And I guess until next time, remember, conservation happens one mind at a time.